Hey everybody, and welcome back to Front-End Expert. In this video, we will be discussing modules within JavaScript. So here we have an HTML file, and it has three different scripts. So it has person.js, helpers.js, and modules.js. So we can go into these three files. First, we have person.js. This is a class person. The constructor takes in a name and sets the variable of this.name to be name. Then it has a sayHello method that logs out hello, this is, and then the name. We also have helpers.js, which has two functions. AlgoExpert logs out AlgoExpert is the best, and frontend expert logs out frontend expert is the best. Okay, so let's come into modules.js, and the first thing I want to show is simply that these JavaScript files have access to each other. So for example, I could call frontend expert, save this, and you can see in the console in the browser, we log out frontend expert is the best. I could also create a person, so I could say const Connor equals new person, and I will give this person the name of Connor. And then I could say Connor.sayHello, call this function, and you can see we get, hi, this is Connor in the console. Now, this probably does what you would expect it to do, but this might not be the best way to accomplish this, so we might want to have different files to represent different parts of our code. This is good. You could imagine if you were working on a huge website, say Amazon.com, there's no way they could put all of their JavaScript in one file, so it makes sense to have multiple for things like individual classes or some helper functions. But this isn't the best way to do this. The reason being is it does something called polluting the global namespace, which simply means that we have added all of our variables to the global namespace. They are global, they're accessible anywhere, and we probably don't want that. We want our variables to only be accessible in their own files, so we want to be scoped to the file rather than globally, and then we can take individual items such as the person class and export them. But we don't want, say, the Connor variable to be accessible in any other file. The reason being that this can cause naming conflicts. Going back to the example of Amazon.com, websites like that have thousands of people working on it, and you don't want to have naming conflicts where two different files have the same variable names. And the same issue can still come up on smaller projects. If you're using frameworks, you don't want your code to have naming conflicts with any frameworks that you might be importing. Okay, so how can we solve this? How can we make sure that the Connor constant is only accessible in this file? Well, we know that constants are scoped to their block, and the same thing for variables defined with let, and then variables defined with var are scoped to a function. So that would mean if we put all of our code inside of a function, let's define a function called myModule, and then we can copy and paste all of the code inside of here. That would mean that we are no longer polluting the global namespace because all of our code is inside of a function. So for example, the Connor constant is only scoped to this block. But the issue here is we have a new global identifier. We have myModule. And we also would need to call this function to actually get the code to run. So I could say myModule, we can call this, and you can see the same thing is happening, but the myModule variable is now a global. We could call this from any other file. So how can we solve this problem? Well, we could make this an anonymous function, but then the issue is, how do we call the function? We can't call myModule anymore because the function doesn't have a name. The solution to this is a bit of a strange syntax. So what we can do is we can wrap this entire function in parentheses, so in the grouping operator. And what this does is it tells JavaScript to treat what is inside of the parentheses as an expression. So this function can be treated as an expression, similar to if we had saved it in a variable like let myModule equal this function. This creates an expression as well. But in this case, we will wrap it in parentheses to create the expression so that we don't have to give a name to the function, and then we can simply call the function. Now, if I run this code, you see we get the same output as before, but none of this code is polluting the global namespace. Now, this syntax of a function that is being immediately called is known as an immediately invoked function expression, and it will work for this simple case. But what would happen if, for example, we wanted to avoid polluting the global namespace with the helpers.js file? Well, we could do the same thing. So I can add a function expression, and then we can add all of this code inside of the function expression. And finally, we can call the immediately invoked function expression. But this isn't going to work anymore. Now we're going to get a reference error that front-end expert is not defined, which makes sense. We did exactly what we wanted. We removed these functions from the global namespace. But that means that this file has no way to access them. So this call to front-end expert doesn't work anymore. And this is where the issue with the immediately invoked function expressions comes up. There are some very convoluted ways that we can utilize these immediately invoked function expressions to sort of emulate the idea of importing and exporting, but we do have a very nice syntax for this instead. So I'm going to come back to the HTML file and remove the defer attribute, and what we can do instead is say type and set type equal to module. So the type of module is going to essentially add the immediately invoked function expression for us. That's the way you can think about it. It is going to remove everything from the global namespace. It also adds defer for us, so we don't need defer. We can have just type as module, and I will add this to all three of our scripts. So we can say this one is type module, and the last script here, type equals module. Okay, so now what we can do is we can come back and remove the immediately invoked function expression and put this code back where it was. And same thing with modules.js. We can remove the immediately invoked function expression and put this code back how it was. But this is still not going to work. Because we made these modules, we still have the same issue. Front-end expert here is not defined because of the fact that this file no longer has access to this file. Now, the way we can solve this is through what is called imports and exports. So for the function front-end expert, I can say that we want to export this function, and I will save this. And now in modules.js, we can import that function. So we can say import, and then we can say star. So this is going to get all of the exports from helpers.js. We can give it a name, so I'll call it helpers. And then we say from, and we pass in the location of the file. So this is going to be the path to that file. If it is in the same directory like these are, we use a period, the /, and then the name of the file. Okay, so now we have this identifier called helpers, and we can use it to reference the exports from this helpers file. So back in modules.js, instead of calling front-end expert, we can say helpers.frontendExpert. And now when I save this, this code is going to work again. We still can't access person just yet, so we could export person as well. So we can export classes just like functions. Again, classes are just functions, but we can export just about anything. So I can say export class person. Then we can come back here and we could do the same thing. So we can say import star as person from, and we can do the person.js file. And this file actually has a capital P to correspond to the capital P in the person class name. And then we could say we want person.person. So this is the person module dot person being the class that was exported from that person module. And now this will work just like it did before. Now you might be saying person.person is pretty ugly code. And we can solve this as well. So instead of import star, which would import everything, what we can do is we can add the curly braces and choose what we want to import. So for example, let's just import person. And now instead of person.person, we can simply say Connor equals new person, save this, and everything works the same. We could do the same for our helpers. So we could call this front-end expert and remove the helpers dot. We could also import the algo expert function as well, as long as we come back to helpers and export this function. So we can export this function, save it, import the algo expert function, and then call it. And now we also log out algo expert is the best. We can also use the as keyword in these imports to rename the imports. So for example, I could rename algo expert to algo, and now instead of calling algo expert, I would call algo, and we would get the same output. This is nice if you did have a naming conflict. So if the thing you're importing has the same name as some function or some other global within your module, then what you can do is you can use this as keyword to change its name. Now, if we come back to the helpers.js file, there are a few other ways that we can export the functions. So rather than the export keyword before the declaration, we can also do this at the end. So I can say export, and then we add curly braces and we say what we want to export. So for example, I want to export algo expert and front-end expert. And you will see this works the same way. We end up exporting whatever is inside of the curly braces here. And if we wanted, we could rename them in the exports. So I could say export algo expert as algo. And then in modules.js, we would simply import algo instead of importing algo expert as algo. And we could even rename this back to algo expert if I wanted. So I could say as algo expert, and then we can call algo expert here, and this would work the same way. And we can also define what we call a default export. So for example, if I wanted algo expert to be the default, then I could say export default and then the function algo expert, and I will add the export keyword back to front-end expert. And now it says that if we import and we don't specify what we want to import, we will import this algo expert function. So if we come back to our modules, the way this works is rather than having the curly brace syntax, I can simply say import algo expert from helpers.js. I will comment out front-end expert for a moment, and you will see we get algo expert is the best, but we didn't need to use the curly braces. We could also combine the two types of exports. So I could import algo expert, comma, and then in the curly braces, front-end expert. And now I could uncomment out this code, and we get front-end expert is the best, and algo expert is the best once again. A lot of the time, we won't want to combine these two syntaxes, but we can if we want to. The most common thing we tend to see is modules that only have a single export, and it will be named as a default export. Or there might be a file like this that is a helpers function file that has a bunch of functions that are all exported, and none of them will be the default export because you can only have one default export. So in a file like this, it doesn't really make sense to have a default export. So let's go back to simply export function. However, in a file like person.js, it makes sense to have a default. So we can say export default class person, since there's only one export here. And we can come back to our modules.js and fix our imports. So we can import the person as a default, and we can move the algo expert import into the curly braces because it is not the default export. Now, coming back to person.js one more time, there are a couple other ways we can do the default export. So I will remove this code for a moment, and we can come down to the bottom of the file, and we could say export default person, and this will work the same way. We can also use export and then the curly brace syntax, and I could say person as default. So essentially, if we rename the export to default, then it will make it the default export. And once again, this works the same way as well. Most of the time, you don't see this last syntax. It's not quite as clean as the others, but it does work. I tend to prefer the export default on the declaration if we are only exporting one thing from the file, and putting all of the exports at the end if we're exporting multiple things, but it's fine to use whatever syntax you prefer as long as you are being consistent. Next, let's come back to modules.js, and we can also dynamically import modules. So what if we had some conditional, like const should say frontend, and we can set this equal to true, and then we can have a condition if should say frontend. Then in this condition, I want to call frontend expert. And to make everything a little bit easier to read, I will get rid of this extra code here, as well as the import of person, as we are not using that. And we can simply import frontend expert from helpers.js. Then this will work exactly as you expect. But this might not be the best way to do this because we only use frontend expert in this case. However, we are importing it regardless. And in this case, it's a bit of a contrived example. This might be a perfectly acceptable way to do it. But if this module was coming from another server, maybe it was something that was a little bit slower to download, it was a very long module that takes a long time to parse, then we might want to be careful about when we import that module. So what we can do instead is we can come inside of the condition and we can await a call to a function called import. So this is different from the standard import syntax. It is a function that can be called conditionally. So inside of this import, we will pass in the path to the file. So we can say helpers.js. And then we need to save the result of the import. So I can say const imported obj because this returns an object. And we can set this equal to helpers.js. And I could do imported obj.frontendExpert, and this will work the same way. However, usually what we do is destructure here. So I could say frontend expert, and then we do not need this call to the object anymore. We can simply call this as frontend expert, and we get frontend expert is the best. And we can also remove the import at the top level because we are not using it anymore. And one thing you might be noticing is that we are using the await keyword even though we aren't inside of a function. So this is one of the other little nuances to modules, and that is that whenever we have type is module in the HTML, so this type equals module that we added here, along with preventing our files from polluting the global namespace, it allows us to use the await keyword at the top level. There's also a few other little changes it makes. So first of all, it automatically invokes strict mode. So it essentially adds use strict to the top of the file for us. So our code will always be in strict mode. And it also changes what this is going to be. So console.log of this at the top level in a module is going to be undefined, whereas in standard code, this would end up being the window. So those are just a few little differences that you should be aware of when you use modules, but for the most part, the major change is simply that we can import and export code, as well as the fact that our code will not pollute the global namespace. Now, finally, I did want to show how in the HTML file, we can also add one more script here, and this is going to be a script that we only import in the case that a browser does not support modules. So the way this works is we add a script tag, and all we need to do with this script tag is we add the source of whatever the JavaScript file we want is. So let's say no module version.js, and then we simply add no module as an attribute, and then we close out the script tag. And all this is going to do is in the case that modules are not supported, the browser is going to ignore these three script tags, and it will instead use this one. So this can be useful to support any users who are using a very old browser that might not support modules. We can add a second version of the code, and they will get that version where all of the code has been moved into a single file, and it will still end up polluting the global namespace. Or you can move it all into a single file and use the immediately invoked function expression to prevent it from polluting the global namespace. But anyways, that's going to be the end of this video on modules. I hope you enjoyed it, I hope you learned something new, and I'll see you in the next one.